today's World Insight with Ken Wei. Trump heats up the race for artificial intelligence. Cutthroat competition or room for cooperation. And a Chinese scholar on the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue and ways to ease maritime tensions in the South China Sea.
Both sides, U.S. and China, should be particularly careful and prudent over how to move on.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Ken Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We begin today's show in the U.S., where President Donald Trump signed an executive order directing government to pull out all the stops to be a leader in artificial intelligence. As a world leader in technology for decades, is the U.S. now feeling the heat? Let's take a look.
When it comes to AI, the U.S. may be playing catch-up. The U.S. government is asking its agencies, academia and industry to make it a priority. In part, the executive order reads, the United States must drive technological breakthroughs in AI across the federal government, industry and academia in order to promote scientific discovery, economic competitiveness and national security. The U.S. President aims to boost research, investment in AI and develop the workforce to run the machine learning technologies that will power self-driving cars, automated manufacturing and design, and the thousands of industries yet to be developed. Critics say the problem with this plan is that it's vague and has no new money behind it. In contrast, China is already deploying AI technologies for all the world to see. This year's TV extravaganza to celebrate the Spring Festival used AI and augmented reality in ways US TV networks can only dream of. AI hotels, machine learning robot waiters, even AI-inspired newsreaders are all high-profile projects that reflect a national investment priority for China.
The first is to strengthen the new type of infrastructure construction, stimulate the building of the artificial intelligence industry, industrial internet and Internet of Things, and accelerate the pace of commercial application of 5G.
The US, with its technological superiority, is still considered a leader in the AI field, but the US government fears China is catching up fast, and that propelled Trump's announcement. Without naming any individual countries, the executive order says the US must, quote, organize the development of an action plan to protect the United States' advantage in AI and AI technology, critical to the United States' economic and national security interests against strategic competitors and adversarial nations. Healthy competition between the US and China when it comes to the technologies of tomorrow could help spur global innovation. But increasingly, a sort of silicon curtain is descending between the two economies, which is forcing other nations to pick a side when it comes to the technologies of tomorrow. Nathan King, CGTN, Washington.
For more on the competition or maybe cooperation, we don't know, about AI, artificial intelligence, with us in our Beijing studio, John Gong, professor from University of International Business and Economics. He's a trade expert, but certainly also have a view on this latest issue. Also in Beijing, Andy Mock, a non-resident fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Joining us in New York from the U.S., Jeremy Kaplan, editor-in-chief of Digital Trends. I want to welcome to the three of you, gentlemen. Mr. Kaplan, I have to invite your expertise here first. First of all, what exactly is this executive order? What's likely to be the impact of this executive order?
Well, the immediate impact is going to be, this is really a policy statement. It's a direction that the president is trying to indicate that the U.S. has an interest in. So before, we've had a lot of private companies, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Qualcomm, et cetera, that have been very interested in heavily investing themselves without sort of oversight or guidance from the U.S. government. So I think that Trump's plan here was really to steer the conversation a little bit, suggest avenues for investment, and avenues for research, and sort of indicate that the U.S. is indeed very interested and very aware of this, the push for artificial intelligence, the importance of this to the overall technology market, and just to indicate we are planning on making some important moves in the future.
Mr. Mark, when you look at the executive order, of course, money is not being mentioned at all. So the most important thing is whether this policy action plan, in a way, will be implemented. How do you understand the significance of this executive order in terms of its capabilities of implementation?
Well, I think that is really the key question, because this is really, in a way, our age's Sputnik moment. So when we look back to John F. Kennedy launching the space race to say, we, the U.S., will put a man on the moon within a decade in response to the USSR's Sputnik. Now, what the difference here, though, is exactly what you mentioned, Tianwei, is resources, because at that time, the U.S. was by far the richest country in the world, and the government had the ability to say that we will bear any burden to achieve our policy goals. The U.S. today is much more constrained, and also in a relative sense. It is not the largest economy in purchasing power parity terms. It's China's catching up. So I think this really is the crux of the issue. And I see this executive order really more as an aspirational document.
Interesting the way you put it. So $22 trillion in national debt, that's also coming out, a piece of news almost at the same time when the executive order is being made known to the public. Professor Gong, how would you understand the current system inside the United States, particularly how resources are being geared up in order to make projects of national importance or national aspiration, using your word, Andy, come true?
Well, first of all, I don't think there's a Sputnik here. I mean, no country is actually leading in the area of AI. Some countries are more or less on the same starting point, including China and the United States and Germany, UK as well. I think we're all starting the same level here. Second,
well, that's for debate. Later we're going to debate about that.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. The second about the R&D funding. I think the private sector, university community are still the workhorse of R&D in the United States. To some extent, there's some funding from the federal government through various branches. For example, the DARPA program, Department of Energy.
Decades ago.
Right. This program has been going on for many, many years. So these organizations definitely are the federal research organizations engaged in this area. And I'm pretty sure this is, we talk about this being a policy statement, but I think he is preaching the converted. I mean, even including people, including organizations within the federal government, they all know it's very important. They've already had programs devoted to this. So, so this is essentially, I think, I would characterize this as more of a PR statement. I mean, because there's a lot of pressure from the community, from the business community, such that the federal government lays more emphasis on AI research, and he's coming up with this.
Okay.
But there's no money into this.
Well, we already see the Department of Defense, for example, Mr. Kaplan, already putting out their own specific plan, allocating a few billion US dollars. You could argue it's not that much money, but at least that's already being allocated and committed. So, Mr. Kaplan, how will different government departments, given your knowledge of the Trump administration's way of operating the government, be able to implement the plan as soon as possible?
Well, I think the Department of Defense moves is exactly right. You've seen one individual agency within the U.S. government that's taking specific action to indicate where AI is being spread out throughout the entire department, and that's going to be in hiring, it's going to be in research, funding of various programs and whatnot. So it isn't necessarily going to be the U.S. investing 10, 20, $50 billion in AI. It's going to be all of these different areas within the U.S. government. DARPA is another great example. So I think that there are a lot of ways that we'll see, but this is really early stages for the U.S. government's involvement in the AI world. We've had private industry that's really been driving it to date in the U.S. and leading, I would say. But But the U.S. government has not been at the forefront of that issue. So we see Donald Trump saying now is a time for the U.S. to actually be the thing that is the impetus for this research.
But may I remind you, Mr. Kaplan, 2016, the Obama administration also put out a strategic plan, as it's called then, on the artificial intelligence. So for many of us from all over the world who do not study this topic on a daily basis, what is the difference between these two plans? Is it a continuation? Is it different directions? How can we see the two parties come out with two different action plans? Are they going to help the United States heading somewhere?
I think it's too early to tell. It's definitely early days in the U.S.'s positioning here. As you've indicated earlier, there isn't any money directly behind this, at least at present, although there certainly was the implication that there would be. So what exactly is Donald Trump planning on doing? How exactly is he differentiating himself from what the Obama administration did? I think it's too early to tell. But if I can riff for a second off of a point your guest already made, the space race was a really fascinating way of a point of reference here. So back in the 60s, we had the U.S. government investing an incredible amount of money, which we had freer access to at the time. In the last decade, we've moved away from that entirely to a private industry-based approach towards space. And what we've seen is great success with companies like SpaceX that have used private dollars to fuel the race and to be very successful. So I'm supposing that that will be the avenue we take for artificial intelligence, where the government says, yes, let's do it, we want to support U.S. companies, and looks to private industry to be the force.
Interesting, you mentioned that case study. Andy, if I remember right, in the Defense Department, for example, there was earlier involvement of Google in some of the specific research, such as something called the Project Maven, I think.
Project Maven.
Yes, exactly. So how, but at the end of the day, because of the public debate about whether a business should be involved in the collecting and the use of data of the public, that was put off. So how will the different roles of government, private sector, and also the awareness of the public likely to work together or against each other in the U.S. current circumstances? Interesting.
No, that's a very great point, Tianwei. I mean, so first of all, I want to mention that even if the U.S. government can throw a lot more money at this, money's not likely to solve this problem, because the biggest bottleneck is the availability of talented AI scientists. And you just can't throw money at it, because all that does is inflate salaries. So I think we need to bear that in mind. That's one challenge the U.S. is facing. But to go back to your point about, is there this unified view of what should be done? I think that's a huge problem, because as Jeremy said, I think the difference between the space race and today is that a lot of those advances were driven by government, whereas AI is driven by the private sector. And there's a question, I think, that can be raised, is that do Americans, a significant subset of Americans, even want the U.S. to win this? Because we look at the increasing questions raised about the legitimacy of the U.S. government. So Project Maven, for our audience members that might not be familiar with this, was that Google had a project with the Pentagon to provide AI applications to help with targeting drones, I believe. So a number of their AI scientists said, we want no part of this. Okay. So they say, we think this is an illegitimate use of AI. But broader, more from a social perspective.
And also it's about who will make the final decision when it comes to military actions.
Yes.
Whether it is the AI itself or the human being involved in the operating of AI. That's a crucial question too.
But there's a broader question here, though, Tianwei, which is not just around AI. But we look at the rise of the progressive movement in the United States, questioning some of the basic precepts of American government, that I think we're going to see a growing body of people question the very legitimacy of many of the government activities.
Right. Well, that's at least the national debate that is going on in the U.S. and also in Europe, I have to say, as well, at different degree. But on the other hand, there's also whether the national competition is happening or not, as one of our panelists mentioned earlier. So earlier we also talked to Dr. Kai-Fu Lee, who is very much on this topic. He explained to me how the two largest economies can break the deadlock in the AI race as he sees it.
The reality is that U.S. is ahead in basic research, but China is actually about equal in its ability to build valuable businesses, monetize them, and create value out of them.
Based on the size of the market, of course.
Based on the size of the market,
and the data.
Also the amount of data, and also the tenacity of the entrepreneurs. A lot of smart money being poured in and given to the right people who work incredibly hard and iterate on that data. And also the government is very supportive in building infrastructure. So these, I think, actually gives advantage to China in terms of execution and monetization. So the question of the competition boils down to how much value is basic research, because China's momentum is faster. Assuming no basic research breakthroughs, China may surpass the U.S. in 3 to 5 years time frame.
So what are you trying to say here? You're trying to read between the lines. There needs to be some kinds of cooperation between China and the United States.
Well, in an ideal world...
Is that the wishful thinking?
In an ideal world, which is always wishful thinking, U.S., China, and China would complement each other. Of course, I think the U.S. government is making that possibly difficult in the future with the trade issue, but also the things related to export control. We'll see what kind of ripples that may have.
That's our exclusive interview with Dr. Kai-Fu Lee, who is talking about competition or cooperation between China and the United States when it comes to artificial intelligence. Coming back to you, John, your reflection about that quote.
Well, I just want to add an additional comment that the kind of difficulties the United States government is imposing on collaboration between China and the U.S. in the AI area is already happening. I've heard instances, for example, that some Chinese students in American universities, they have found very difficult to pursue their doctoral studies in AI area. So, in a way, the technological decoupling, I think, driven by the U.S. government is already happening. And AI is the primary area that the United States government is taking actions.
That is one thing, whether the two economies are growing apart, particularly when it comes to the issue of technology. AI certainly is a big reflection of that. But even more importantly, related to that, may I also invite Jeremy to comment on this, is about the standards, the rules, the regulations. Jeremy, as far as I know, that there is a lack of rules regarding AI on an international basis. And also the United States has refused to talk about rules related to robots, suggesting it is too premature to draw upon rules in the UN system. Meanwhile, you see that there likely to be an intentional cutaway between the two economies from the current Washington's perspective, particularly when it comes to technology. So how are we going to see competition and also going against one another in this direction? Some say it is the most dangerous among all.
You're hitting right to the heart of the matter here. Cooperation versus collaboration. Competition versus collaboration. It's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out over the next few years, especially because there does seem to be this conflict between economic superpowers here, and Donald Trump's view of where we're going to go here is definitely, we see that these two forces fighting against each other. The challenge is that when you compare the AI race to the space race, we keep coming back to that point. The space race had a very clear goal.
John is not very happy about that.
I just find it to be a perfect analogy.
Right?
There was a very clear point when somebody won, right? There was a landing on the moon, and we were done. And I think with artificial intelligence, there's going to be a lot of growth upon a lot of research, very slow and very steady. So collaboration seems to be the way for us all to move forwards. And yet, as the U.S. and China wrestle with the issues of how much data do we share and how open are our markets, it becomes very hard for that collaboration to occur. So I think I think positioning statements like the U.S. government's recent one, I think are going to be very important for researchers and for companies that are looking to collaborate with Chinese companies. So it's just we're unable to do so if we think that the U.S. government is trying to slow us down in that field.
I see. Andy, the U.S. has its plan. Well, you please call it plan, this executive order. China also had its plan, according to some earlier documents. So the question is, when the two has reached this stage, rather than a few years ago, has reached this stage, would they be able to realize that they probably, when working together, will very much benefit the speed and the efficiency of the development of AI? China has huge pool of data. That's just a matter of fact, given the population and the way people use data here. And the U.S. certainly has the technology. But the application part, China does it so well than the other parties in the world. So, Andy, your thought here?
Well, I think
it's almost like fortune-telling question I'm asking you.
Well,
sorry, sir.
No, it is and it isn't. I mean, so I'd say, first of all, I agree with what Kai-Fu said, but I'd take it a little bit further to say I think China has already won the AI race, and the reason is exactly for what.
According to John, we're not having a race, okay? So whatever it is,
I think it's a race.
I beg to disagree.
State your point.
Okay. So I think that China already has won, because a lot of people say data is the new oil, and like you said, Tianwei, China has the most data, it has the most resources that matter. I think the other point here is that China has a plan, the U.S. has a plan. However, China is willing to cooperate with the U.S. However, I think the U.S.'s worldview and its plan is that it has to beat China and exclude China. So I think that is one of the biggest differences. And I fear that what this will do is that will actually end up isolating the U.S. because for some of these reasons, not just Chinese students, but Indian students, other of the best and brightest from around the world will be put off from going to the U.S. And that this could have a ripple effect, a domino effect, that really will set back the U.S.'s ability to remain competitive.
We only have almost 1 minute to go before we wrap up this discussion. John, go to you once again as well, because the other parties are watching what China and the United States are doing, because after all, they are the big technology countries and they are the big application countries. So would they be forced from now on to look at the two different, to figure out which line shall I be in for now?
Well, I think I'm always a little bit skeptical of the idea that two governments would work together and do research together and collaborate in these developments. I think as long as the government just stays out of the picture, gets their hands out of the picture, cooperation, collaboration will happen among universities on both sides of the Pacific, among companies on both sides of the Pacific, and capital will flow and facilitate these joint research. So I think as long as the government just stay out of the picture and don't impose those artificial discrimination, artificial policies that discriminate a foreign company, foreign students, foreign universities, it's going to happen, I think.
Well, we have different views certainly in this discussion. It is a fascinating discussion as the technology moves further. And thank you so much for the three of you for being here on the same panel and share your thoughts here with us. Jeremy Kaplan coming from New York, John Gong, Andy Mok here with us in Beijing. Really appreciate it, gentlemen, for being with us. All the best. Stay with us here on World Insight with me, Tianwei. Still to come on the program. A Chinese scholar talks about the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue and ways to ease maritime tensions in the South China Sea. That interview after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tianwei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Vietnam's Deputy Prime Minister, who's also the Foreign Minister, Pham Binh Minh, has arrived in the DPRK ahead of a planned summit between the U.S. President Donald Trump and DPRK leader Kim Jong Un in Vietnam's capital later this month. Pham Binh Minh is expected to stay until Thursday. The visit is part of the preparations for the second meeting between President Trump and Mr. Kim. The two leaders held their first summit in June last year in Singapore. After the first meeting, President Trump said Pyongyang no longer poses a nuclear threat and the DPRK is no longer America's biggest problem. As part of our special series, an updated vision, a review and outlook of China's diplomatic strategies, we talked to Professor Zhu Feng, Dean of the School of International Relations of Nanjing University. He compares U.S. policies on the DPRK under the Trump and Obama administrations. Professor Zhu, welcome to CGTN. First question for you, sir. I know you've been over the years doing a lot of research about the DPRK nuclear issue and also the South China Sea security issue. Those two issues are actually quite different from one another if you look at it from the security terms. One is much more needing the cooperation between China and the United States on the DPRK nuclear issue, for example, and both have the desire of different degree to work together. On the other hand, the South China Sea issue does require a role of both countries, but very different role and expectations from one another, toward one another too. So, Professor Zhu, how do you see these two issues in a way crystallize the overall nature of China-U.S. strategic cooperation in the regional issue and also in the security issue?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Then we will see there's a very, very notable difference between the Obama administration and Trump administration on how to handle the DPRK issue. I think the two sort of very, let's say, adequate change just happened. The first is Obama administration would like to maintain some sort of strategic patience until the DPRK decide to give up. Otherwise, U.S. will not just engage the DPRK anymore. Then we will see Trump say, yeah, I would like to talk. So then we see last June there was first summit meeting between the Trump and the King in Singapore. So then such a, we say, change is of course very, very tremendous. So Trump would like to just have to use his persuasion to show some sort of his, we say, some sort of his capability to resolve the DPRK issue. But it's some sort of his priority. He just consider his personal persuasion could work. Then second difference, we also see Obama administration say the denuclearization will be first priority. So no action of the denuclearization, no engagement, no contact, no even just has a high-level diplomatic contacts. But Trump administration say, I don't care how long it will take, the denuclearization could be. But most important, what's the Trump administration most important concern is they want to just have to get the DPRK, even just tentatively terminate their nuclear and missile test. But the problem is
that will be a political win for him. And he's looking at 2020, as simple as that.
It's a political win, but there's no, we say, concrete movement of the denuclearization. So it's some sort of a very, very tremendously reshifted priority on how to handle the DPRK.
One is about immediate reaction, the other is about possibly long-term.
Possibly long-term and no timeline, just definitely set up and also show another, it's not a strategic impatience, it's a political patience. The Trump administration would like to leave the time for the future denuclearization, but they just believe, even DPRK just tentatively, we say, suspend their nuclear test or missile test. They consider it's a bigger win for White House.
But the allies of the United States in the region, though, could think in a very different term. For example, South Korea, who is apparently patiently waiting for Washington still to react, even though the two Koreas have already quite active over the past few months interacting with one another, at least for the short term. So will that create, in even just the short term, more different opinions among the U.S. and its top allies in the region? And what would that mean for China and the U.S. security situation as a result?
Of course, I see the dynamic of the Korean Peninsula has never been more tricky. On the one hand, we will see some sort of such a diplomatic engagement to DPRK completely achieved. Then we will see some sort of diplomatic détente also now is available.
So you could already tell the story before it happens in a way.
Of course, I think a couple of years, we say, prior to some sort of last year's Pyeongchang Olympic diplomacy, no one can imagine how far they will go with such a diplomatic engagement. But the problem is Then DPRK also has been left some sort of a new credential. On the one hand, political and diplomatic engagement now is going on. But on the other hand, the DPRK also want some sort of their tremendous improvement of their economic development. So they strongly ask for the lifting of the sanctions. But Trump administration, of course, is very careful about some sort of betting on the time of DPRK's some sort of delay tactic of the nuclear disarmament. So diplomatic engagement is on the way, but on the other hand, lifting of the sanction is totally rejected. So then it's also creates some sort of growing uncertainty. How far the DPRK will go without some sort of real economic return or gain to the Pyongyang. So then I see the situation remain very vulnerable. But at least I see the Trump's some of the personal political gain. I mean, DPRK does not test the nuclear bomb and a missile one and one endlessly, then it will get the White House feel much pressed. But the problem is, international community is also very, very highly concerned when the denuclearization could be genuinely or truthfully just achieved. So there is a growing controversy.
Besides the nuclear security issue, China is also facing maritime challenges in the Asia-Pacific region. For example, that's going on between China and the United States. On Monday, 2 U.S. naval destroyers, without permission from China, sailed into the adjacent waters of Ren'ai and Meiji Reef in China's Nansha Islands. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has strongly objected to the action.
The trespass of U.S. warships infringed on China's sovereignty and disrupted the peace, security and good order in relevant waters. China strongly deplores and firmly opposes such behaviors. China has all along respected and upheld the freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea that countries are entitled to under international law. However, China is firmly opposed to actions that damage sovereignty and security of littoral states under the pretext of freedom of navigation and overflight.
Statements coming from the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson earlier in the week. So when it comes to issues over the South China Sea, Professor Zhu Feng in our interview pointed out that maritime competition between China and the U.S. is becoming, in his words, riskier for both sides. What about the South China Sea issue? I mean, obviously, U.S.-China with more looking at each other as competitor, the escalation of the situation in the South China Sea could increase. However, China over the past 1 year or two has been able to approach its neighbors, particularly regarding the security issue on the South China Sea, with COC. And it seems that the neighbors are quite satisfied with both the speed and approach. So, Professor, how do you see the South China Sea issue will be, for example, between China and the United States? What is likely to be the role of the others in the region, very briefly?
Personally, I'm arguing this way. South China Sea issue also become most, let's say, risky ones between the U.S. and China, because maritime security competition now is regain or overtake some sort of such a security competition between the U.S. and China. In the Americans' eyes, they see the China's speed of the warships building, islands reclamation and construction in the South China Sea, and for the first time rearm the China with some sort of a maritime naval capability. So then, since the end of the Second World War, no country besides the U.S. could just move that far to expand the maritime presence, and also could just bring up a naval capability at the maritime domain. So then, some sort of China's, we say, safeguarding effort to the Chinese sovereign assets in the eyes of Americans, become China's some sort of maritime strategist with expansion. So then I see both sides in a collision course over the South China Sea. I think Beijing's expectation is very limited. We're just trying to safeguard the sovereign claim. We're just trying to, in some sort of reasonable way, increase China's maritime presence to, we say, justify China's real control over the Chinese maritime assets. But the problem is they're all turning into some sort of Chinese strategic push for big maritime powers in the Western Pacific. So then, on the other hand, we will see what's the formidable base of American security supremacy in the Asian Pacific. It's just exactly Americans' unchallengeable naval military presence in Western Pacific. So with China's naval capability just keep going up, the U.S. fear and worry is quite deepening. They consider China is not just a competitor. China is also just trying to some sort of, their view is a revisionist power.
Is there any hope that the speed of escalation at least slow down? And with the two sides even consider the security ties now as one of the pillars of the bilateral relations rather than the trade and economic ties, will that in a way change the way how two sides are looking at the maritime issue and the so-called challenge from the other side?
I see, given the changed backdrop of bilateral relations, mainly out of the trade war, both sides, U.S. and China, should be particularly careful and prudent over how to move on South China Sea. Otherwise, any incidental collision between the two warships, China and the U.S., also probably could escalate into some sort of theater wars. And any death toll, if there's some sort of such a incidental collision caused, then will be very badly poisoning the bilateral relations, and it also could be driving some sort of very, very big hostility movements against each other. So then, in my understanding, I think the economic and the commercial relationship usually it used to be a stabilizer between the U.S.-China relations, but now it has shifted over to mil-mil relations. If such a incidental collision or death toll couldn't be avoided, you can imagine if that happened, then it will get to the bilateral relations just looking like some sort of free fall. So that's some sort of biggest potential of dangers.
But of course, the two militaries over the past 2 years have been able to work out some of the temporary agreement.
Yeah, two memos. Yeah.
Exactly.
But I also once published my research outcome and just a warning, such a previous memos on how to just behave either of a side in maritime domain now is totally not enough. Because that kind of memo is just some sort of, we say...
the bottom line.
Yeah, the safety measures above both sides avoid some sort of further misjudge, avoid some sort of a non-professional actions. But today, then we will see South China Sea become a whirlwind to, we say, very potentially disrupt the bilateral relations. And on the other hand, the irony is either side feel very justified to take some sort of acts. So then, for the time being, most important thing is not just a safety measure. For the time being, most important resign for the both sides to behave themselves is confidence-building measures. They should recognize how stormy now the water is and how some sort of uncertain if they couldn't behave themselves.
We haven't talked about the ultimate danger that has created and made the Cold War lasted for decades. That is, throw everything into the ideology basket. And when relations are going downslope, there is always the big danger of that. Professor Zhu, what is your observation so far? How much is that danger in front of us, let's just say between China and the United States?
The trajectory of our bilateral relations now is totally with some sort of end open war. If
meaning all possible.
Yes, if neither of us sides couldn't just act cautiously and very, very seriously, then we will see such a relation will become very emotional. On the other hand, we should understand that by very, very interest nature of American political system, U.S. is democracy, is a rule of law country, but U.S. is never falling short of discrimination, bias, and even hatred. So then if we're back to the 50s, then we will see McCarthy some sort of such a hysteria against the young Chinese communist or socialist. So then what is really feared me most is the U.S. will falling into some sort of a new McCarthyism. It's some sort of quite intended, emotional, and out of controllable. It's less controllable, some sort of hostilities vis-a-vis China. That will put our relations into a huge stake.
Thank you, Professor Zhu, for being with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
My interview with Professor Zhu Feng on the Korean Peninsula denuclearization issue and tensions in the South China Sea. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.